Okay, so we're out here on the CX-7. We got a whole box of new parts. I'll put a list in the description of the new parts that I used. But let's go ahead and talk about what we're going to do to fix this car. Now, usually when you do this job, usually they'll go ahead and they'll replace the chain, the VVT actuator, the guides, the tensioner, basically the whole shebang. They'll replace all of that. I'm not going to do that in this case, and the reason why is very simple. I'm not looking to replace a bunch of parts that don't need to be replaced. I'm looking to fix the problems that this car has quickly, easily, and cheaply. And that means I'm not going to replace just everything just because. I'm only going to replace the parts that are broken, which is pretty much just the timing chain. Now, a lot of people will replace the VVT actuator because that does tend to be a source of noise and it is a high failure rate component on these cars. But this particular car isn't having an issue with that. The Mazda does have a TSB for the VVT actuator, just like they do for the timing chain, but this car is not included in that TSB. Now, as per the TSB, if the car is exhibiting certain symptoms, which is a very loud rattle at startup, they want you to take the cover off so you can see it, and the first thing they want you to check is the lock pin button and the metal around it, which is right here. This is the lock pin button, and they want you to check for any damage around it. Oftentimes the metal will actually break around this button, or the button will be missing. Obviously that's not the case here. This is actually a later revised VVT actuator. They added heat treatment around this lock pin button to prevent that from happening. The next thing they say to do is these notches, to make sure they are lined up. Now there's a notch on an inner component and an outer component, which are allowed to move independently when the VVT actuates. They state to take this apart, and if those notches are lined up, then there's nothing wrong with the VVT. If they don't line up, you rotate the engine a few times and check again, and if they still don't line up, well, then you have VVT issues. This one was lined up as soon as I took it apart, so there's no issues with the VVT actuator. So I'm going to try something that I haven't seen done yet, and that is I'm going to try to replace the timing chain without having to loosen the bolt holding the VVT actuator or the cam sprocket on. Now, as I mentioned before, these are not keyed to the camshafts. The way you're supposed to time this is you use a special tool which is installed right now. I did get that tool, and I'll put a list in the description, the tool that you need for that. You get that tool to hold the cams, and then you have the other tool at the bottom that holds the crank, and you're supposed to replace these diamond friction washers behind these sprockets, and then tighten down those bolts as well as the crank dampener bolt while they're all held in time, and that's how you time it. But my theory is that because the new chain should be exactly the same as the old chain was, or at least as it was when it was new, I should be able to just go ahead, and I'll have to replace the diamond friction washers at the bottom, but I should be able to just leave these the actuator and the sprocket installed to the cam and just drape the new timing chain over top of it, and they should line up properly to each other. And even if they aren't perfect in relation to the crank, that's all going to be timed when I tighten the crank back down anyway, and that way I don't have to loosen up these top bolts and deal with any of that or replace those washers. Okay, step one. Compress the tensioner without getting in the way of the camera too much. So you got this little tab here. We're going to push it down, and that will allow us to compress it. And I don't have a lot of light. Then there's a little hole behind that tab, which we will need to get this pin into to lock it. There we go, and it's locked. Okay, now we'll see if we can just work the chain off, bring it around the tensioner so it loosens up. Just pull it right off here. And there's our old timing chain, and we don't have to worry about this coming out of time because it is currently held in place by the specialty tool. Okay, so we're at the bottom here. Now this is the timing chain sprocket, and behind there, between the timing chain sprocket and the oil pump chain sprocket, if I can get it out, this is the diamond friction washer. Goes between the timing chain sprocket and the oil pump drive sprocket. And there's another one behind this sprocket that needs to be replaced as well. Now this is the oil pump drive chain, this is the oil pump back here, this is the oil pump driven sprocket. Now we have to remove this so I can get this sprocket out and replace that washer. So I'm going to just loosen up the oil pump drive gear. Now to hold it, I'm using just an adjustable pin wrench. You can get these from Harbor Freight. They're meant for angle grinders. So these will fit nicely into the holes on the sprocket, which will hold it, and then I can get a 10mm ratchet on it. And hopefully it will cooperate with me and just loosen up nicely. Okay, so that didn't work the way I hoped it would. It keeps slipping out. So we're going to go to plan B, which is remove the oil pump chain tensioner and try to just loosen to work the oil pump chain off of the sprockets and not even touch the oil pump drive sprocket mount. We'll pull that out, and there is a spring behind here. No big deal. There it is. Well, gee, I should have just done that in the first place. Oil pump drive chain. Pull the oil pump drive off. And there is the diamond friction washer that we need to replace. Okay, so we got a new diamond friction washer. Put that on. Now we'll put the oil pump drive sprocket on. You gotta make sure all of this is nice and clean so that the diamond friction washers can get plenty of friction. So we're gonna drape this back on. There we go. So now we'll put our second diamond friction washer on to go between the oil pump drive sprocket, or oil pump drive sprocket and the timing chain sprocket. Now we'll go to the top and put the timing chain on. There's a marked link on the new timing chain. Okay, so we'll thread this around the lower sprocket first. Around the VVT actuator. Okay, now just work it on there gently. We'll just go ahead, make sure everything is on there properly, and it is, and we will extend timing chain tensioner, and it's all nice and tight, and there we have it, timing chain's installed. I'm sure some people are going to want to know why the chain didn't fit right onto that sprocket the first try, so I'll go ahead and explain now. The reason is because those slots on the backs of the cams that fit into that tool, this isn't a perfect system. There is a tiny bit of slop and play in there, so you can actually rotate these cams a tiny bit the way they sit. Now, they also are wanting to kind of rotate away from each other. So when I took the old timing chain off, this cam, or maybe both of them, rotated slightly, and so the teeth weren't lining up perfectly with the new chain, especially since the new chain isn't stretched at all. So I just had to get a wrench onto these hexes that are molded into the cams and move them back towards each other just a tiny bit, and then when I did that, it fit down right over top of it nicely. And as you can see now, the chain is on. We don't have any slop in the chain, and it's all good to go. Now what I have to do is, we're pretty much ready to put the timing cover on, but before I do that, I have to clean up all these mating surfaces because this engine uses RTV rather than a gasket. So the mating surfaces are all cleaned up, and we're going to apply a layer of ultra black to the mating surfaces, pop the timing cover back on. Okay, so we're ready to install the harmonic balancer. So first things first, we're going to need to put in the new friction washer. Just set that on the crank snout and get that set down as far as possible. Just going to be about there. Just push that in a little bit with the dampener. Okay, so that's seated all the way. Now I'm going to go ahead and just put just a little bit of oil on the outside of the harmonic balancer snout. This is so that the seal will have some lubrication. Don't want to get any on the inside though. We want to make sure that the surface that the friction washer is going against is going to be nice and clean so that it does not slip at all. So now we're going to go set this in. Okay. Now we'll rotate this just a little bit until it lines up with this bolt hole and install a bolt into that hole to hold this still. It looks like we're going to need a little bit longer bolt. Okay, now we'll put in a new crank pulley bolt. Now this is a torque to yield bolt, so they do want you to replace it every time you remove it. Okay, so this is, because this is torque to yield, it's going to get torqued in two stages. The first is we're going to torque it down to 75 foot-pounds, and then we'll go an additional 90 degrees. So we'll get our torque wrench on here. Alright, so we're at 75 foot-pounds. So now what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and remove this bolt. Then we're also going to remove the crankshaft locking tool. If I can get my wrench on it. And we'll want to remove the camshaft locking plate as well. And the reason we're removing all these locking tools is because we need to do the final torque, which is the 90 degrees on the dampener bolt. Now the timing peg is strong enough to hold it to the initial 75 foot-pounds, but is not strong enough to hold it for that additional 90 degrees. So we don't want that locking tool or the camshaft locking tool in place while we're doing that final torquing, because there is the potential that it could break things. We want to be holding the actual dampener itself, but because we've already tightened down this bolt to 75 degrees, the timing between the crankshaft and the camshaft should already be locked, so we don't have to worry about that changing. So this is going to be our tool to hold the crankshaft dampener while we tighten it down. This is a universal fan clutch holder. Not really designed for this purpose, but it's definitely heavy duty enough. It has some of these holes in the ends here, so I've just put these 5/16 bolts into the holes at the end here, and that's going to go and fit into our spokes on the dampener, and then the handle will just jam against the ground, and that should hold the dampener still while we tighten down the bolt. So we're gonna have to fish this in here. And this tool is available for rental from some auto parts stores. I got this one from O'Reilly's. So now we'll go ahead and mark 90 degrees on the bolt. Took some doing, but you got the bolt torqued down. You can see the marks there. So we're fully torqued now. I did have to put the end of the handle of the tool on top of a block of wood because it started slipping once it started getting tight. Excuse me. And then the bolts, you can see they're pretty badly tweaked. They started to bend and slip off of the dampener once the torque started getting up there, so I ended up flipping them around so that the heads would act as kind of like retainers to keep it from slipping off the balancer. And took a whole lot of force on the end of that breaker bar because it's not very long and there's not a lot of space, but we finally got it tightened down. So what we're going to do now is turn the engine over a few times, put it back to top dead center on cylinder number 1 compression stroke. We're going to put our tools back in and make sure that it is still in time. So the engine's been spun over a few times. We're getting close to TDC on cylinder 1. So we'll go ahead and put our timing peg back in. So the engine is back at TDC on the compression stroke of cylinder 1. Crankshaft is resting against the timing peg. So now's the moment of truth. We'll find out if our camshafts are still in time, which hopefully they are, because this is going to be terrible if they aren't. So we'll take our cam locking tool, slide it into the slots, and look at that, it fits perfectly, which is great news. That means that the engine is 100% in time, and we can go ahead and continue on with the reassembly of the rest of the engine. So we don't need this camshaft tool in here anymore. We'll go ahead and pull that out, and we're going to go down below. We'll get the crankshaft position sensor installed, put the blind plug back in the hole for the SST, and we'll continue on. So this next part is a little bit out of order from the way Mazda wants you to do it. So I'm going to put this bolt back in here to hold the dampener. We're going to pull the SST out. Now Mazda wants you to leave the SST in when you put in the crankshaft position sensor, which is reasonable enough except for the fact that I can't actually reach the SST once the crankshaft position sensor is in. So I'm pulling it out now, and we will use that bolt to hold the crankshaft dampener still so that we can line up the crankshaft position sensor. And we'll reinstall the plug into the hole. Take our crank position sensor. I'm going to plug it in now because it's going to be easier than when it's tightened up. Now you'll notice there's a tooth here that's green. Now I actually marked this earlier before I put the dampener on because it was easier, but this tone ring goes all the way around the dampener, and they're all the teeth are evenly spaced, but there's a gap up here at the top. Now you want to go from that gap and you want to count 20 teeth this way, counterclockwise, when it's installed. And the 20th tooth is the one that I've marked with the green mark. Now that tooth needs to be lined up with the center point of the crankshaft position sensor. You notice there's these oval holes so you can adjust it. And I've also marked the center point of the crankshaft position sensor as well. So we'll put the bolts in. Now what I'm going to do is line up the center point of the crankshaft position sensor with that 20th tooth, which is marked in green, and I'm going to tighten down the bolts. I want to get this as close as possible, because if not, the engine, the PCM will not be happy, and that looks pretty good. So tighten the bolts down. And remove the locking bolt from the crankshaft dampener. And that's it. So the high pressure fuel pump goes right here, and it rides on this triple lobe here. So just a little bit of engine oil so that it doesn't start up dry. And we have the high pressure fuel pump here, and this piston is actually loose. And that has to ride over the lobe. So what we'll do is we'll rotate the engine until the lobe is not pointing at where the plunger is going to be. That way we can get this on more easily. Not a lot of space in here with all these wires in the way. So I'm just angling it on there, and so that the plunger rides on top of the lobe, and then just push it down a little bit to compress the plunger, and it will pop right on. And there's a few dowels that need to be lined up. Definitely got the top one, the front one in, but I think there's another dowel. There we go. Put some of the bolts in. So the engine's all back together. We're still waiting on some new spark plugs and a turbocharger. This is about as far as I can go right now, but as soon as I get the turbocharger and those new spark plugs in, we can go ahead and put the rest of it together.